and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now your host for the Millennial Round Table, Liberty McArtor.
Thanks for being with us on the Millennial Round Table today. So happy you're here. And I always say this, but we really do have a packed show today. There is so much great content to discuss, and I'm really excited about the perspectives that we're going to be hearing from our panelists on the show today. So as a reminder, follow along with our topics at pointofview.net, because there are a lot of great articles that we're highlighting here, and I'd love for you to read them yourself. But let me introduce who I have with me around the round table today. In studio is Peyton Luke. She is a media specialist at First Liberty Institute, as well as the producer and co-host for First Liberty Live. And it's always a pleasure to have you in studio, Peyton. Thanks for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Liberty.
And then this hour on the line, we have Ethan Watson. He is a regular on the Millennial Round Table now, so you'll recognize him, and he's got some great insight and articles to bring us today, and he is a Young Voices contributor. Ethan, thank you for being here.
Always a pleasure. Happy to be here.
So, Ethan, I want to start with something that you recently had published in USA Today, and I think it's just a really important topic, and I think that you really hit the nail on the head here with some things that are happening on the right, on the conservative side. So you have an article in USA Today entitled, "Trump Built GOP into a Big Tent. Conservatives Now Threaten to Tear It Down." It's certainly true that we have a lot of ideological diversity in the Republican Party now. And so that's been really interesting to watch, including, people leaving the Democrat Party and coming over to the Republican Party. But we're starting to see some of these factions within the Republican Party warring and debating. And so you have some suggestions for them. Do you want to walk us through your article?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this sort of started to happen after the strike on Iran's nuclear facilities last month, where you had a lot of people within the Big Tent Party, particularly people that were sort of brought over on the Tulsi Gabbard anti-war message. They had some questions about that strike on Iran, which I think is warranted. I mean, it's a big move, and it could have some pretty dire consequences down the road. But the Trump loyalists, the people that always repeat his line no matter what, instead of meeting the questioners where they're at and saying, no, here's how this is actually good for America, they said, you're being disloyal, you're grifting, you're running some kind of con, and you just lack faith in the president. And I have never questioned him since he rode down the golden escalator in 2015. And that really struck a chord with me, because I feel like that kind of, lemming behavior, that's typical of the Democratic Party, right? They all start repeating the canned line as soon as the message comes down from on high. But Republicans, we're supposed to be the diverse party. We're supposed to be the party that incorporates everyone from the libertarians to the nationalist right, the Maha, the Silicon Valley tech bros. And that dissent is really good. But when you start gatekeeping and saying, no, I am loyal and you are disloyal, that's just a really toxic, off-putting way to deliver your message. And it's going to hurt us in the long term, I think.
Yeah, I think you have some insightful critique there. Peyton, what was your response?
Sure. My thoughts are I agree with Ethan. At the beginning of his article, he says we need to encourage conversation and debate versus, some people are just seizing the opportunity for tribalism regarding some of the situations that have come up recently, particularly with Iran. And it is interesting to watch because, I think people were over the smooth politicians saying whatever to get them elected or like. And then Trump comes in. He was brash. He was against the establishment. And, that's why people rallied to him. And now people almost seem surprised when he makes decisions that aren't, the popular opinion. And he acts according to his conscience and for the overall good as he sees it of America. But I agree that we need to have conversation and debate around these things and not just, turn on each other or turn on our party because of something necessarily that the president does. Let's have these conversations. Let's have these debates. Let's make things better going forward, because I think you need that in any circle, in any, whether it's friendships, family, relationships, but also in politics. It's okay to disagree, but instead of just turning your back on something or someone, I think you need to provide conversation and information and facts.
Yeah. And, Ethan, you made a good point about how some people were saying, I trust Trump, trust in Trump. That always, kind of gives me the creeps a little bit when people talk about a political figure in that way, because as you argue very well that, in terms of, obviously as Christians, our first loyalty is to the Lord, right? But then as Americans, we need to be, faithful to the Constitution. And if we can be, supportive of and fans of a political figure, but that doesn't mean that we just have to buy everything they're selling hook, line, and sinker all the time. So, it was interesting because, there were the people that, especially with the whole Iran situation, who were always towing Trump's line, that were upset at what he did. There were people who were typically critical of Trump, that were actually supportive of his decision. So it was a really interesting time. But then, like you lay out some examples, there were people that were just not willing to have the debate at all. But that's really why you've seen a lot of people move from the Democratic Party over to the Republican Party, including, lifelong Democrats, isn't it?
Right, absolutely. I mean, the Democrats went so crazy with this that we actually have a Kennedy on our side right now. I mean, the Kennedys are like the golden children of the Democrat Party. Mm-hmm. And so that's just a great case study in how crazy the Democrat Party has gotten with this sort of tribalism and towing the line. And don't you dare step out of line or we're going to cancel you. That's why people think they're nuts. And that's why people came and elected President Trump. And we need to really maintain that sort of diversity of opinion. And one final point on this whole, thou shalt not criticize Donald Trump. Recently, we've been seeing a little bit of softening on the Epstein position. Just today, we're hearing rumblings that Ghislaine Maxwell might testify. We're seeing that maybe some files are actually going to be unsealed after all. That's because Trump isn't really an ideologue. He doesn't have a set of policy prescriptions that he really sticks to. He just likes to make people happy and he likes to win. He's very responsive to his base and to the markets. So when we criticize him, he will move the ball sometimes. He'll back off on the tariffs. He'll start to release files on Epstein. We need to keep doing that. It wasn't the loyalists that are constantly kissing up to Trump that are making this happen. It's those of us who are coming out here and saying, Mr. President, I voted for you, but this isn't what I voted for. And we need to keep holding him accountable. And I'd say the same whether it was Donald Trump or J.D. Vance or Barack Obama in the White House.
Yeah, good point. Peyton?
Yeah, I'm going to praise Ethan and his article here for him. I love his line of let's make America graceful again by challenging people when we disagree and then welcoming them back without grudges. A lot of people are squandering their popularity on social media and in popular culture if we keep up the circular firing squad. So we need to reject the personality cult outright and hold our leaders accountable. Be loyal to the United States above all else, not to any one person or party. Ethan, nicely done on your article.
Yes, definitely. And if you want to read that for yourself, then go to pointofview.net where you can follow along with all of our articles today. And our goal on the Millennial Round Table is to keep the conversation alive. So even if we end up having differing perspectives on any of these topics, we want to keep the conversation flowing. We want to have healthy debate and encourage you to do the same. And that's what we will be doing. We're about to go to a break, but when we come back, I want to talk about something that is just so relevant because it's always changing and impacting our lives. AI, of course, again, but I want to get some different perspectives on this from Peyton and Ethan, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Radical elements on the street are making radical demands of Democrats. Earlier this month, Axios interviewed more than 24 House Democrats. They related a growing anger among the Democratic base. The lawmakers reported that at town hall meetings and in individual meetings, activists demanded more violence. They were told that what they were doing to confront the Trump administration and ICE agents was not enough. The activists even suggested there needs to be blood to grab the attention of the press and the public. One radical suggested what we really need to do is be willing to get shot. In a recent commentary, Joshua Arnold believes that the foundation of all these statements is a Marxist worldview that has jettisoned Christianity's regard for human dignity, and that has reimagined all human relationships essentially as power struggles. This is a call for a social revolution that will overturn the existing social order. He reminds us that Marxist tactics usually just involve constant destruction of powers that be, with no thought of constructive rebuilding. In previous commentaries, I've quoted other authors and pundits who also remind us that the left wants to destroy but rarely provides any blueprint for rebuilding. We should remember that the current radicalism in the streets didn't start with the 2024 election of Donald Trump. America has suffered through numerous protests in the past that resulted in blocked traffic, defaced property, burning buildings, and injured police officers. Democratic leaders have a choice to make. Do they encourage these radicals, or do they suggest that they try to make their case and work for the next election? The radicals have already made it clear that they think civility isn't working. That is why many of these leaders are saying nothing and are just trying to ignore them. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to the Millennial Round Table. In this hour, or in this segment, I want to talk about an article from World Magazine. Always great reporting over at World. And it's called ChatGPT, AI is forcing teachers and students to redefine education. So this article really goes in depth. It discusses the use of AI in elementary classrooms all the way up to college. And I think it's relevant for us just because there are so many questions that come up whenever we talk about AI. And so whether you have kids or grandkids in college, or maybe you're using it yourself or trying to figure out, whether or not it's okay and how it's changing and impacting us, it's just something to talk about. And I think it's always great to get younger perspectives too. So that's why I wanted to bring it up for the Millennial Roundtable today. But just a quick overview, and then we'll dive into some of our opinions here. 30% of college kids are currently using ChatGPT. A third of those use it for drafting essays, and a quarter for helping them come up with exam answers. So it is something that's being used a lot, not by everyone, but in I would say ways that include cheating, but there are other ways that it can be useful as well, and I want to talk about some of those. But when you start talking about this, particularly in education, really the big questions that come up are, what is education for? If AI can produce something so efficiently, what's the point of us learning how to do it at all? And then should classrooms embrace this? So, Ethan, I think you're our resident Gen Zer today, so I want to kick this off to you and get kind of your perspective, whatever aspect of this article you'd like to talk about. Just give us some of your thoughts.
Sure. Yeah. So, I think I can speak on this as someone who just finished undergrad. I'm going to law school this fall. I use ChatGPT or some other similar AI tool on a daily basis. I use it to tell me what's going on with the sports teams I'm interested in. If I'm interested in a news topic, but I don't really know where to start, I'll just ask AI to give me a rundown. It's really good at that. It's also really good at helping me find sources, much like Wikipedia is. So if I'm starting an article, I'm not the biggest fan of researching in the world. I think it's a little dry. I'd much rather be crafting sentences. And so I'll ask AI, hey, can you help me find some resources to use? And then I'll go read those resources and still obviously vet them and think about them. But I found it to be a huge time saver. Now, the key point here is I'm still doing a lot of the thinking on my own. I'm thinking about what these sources say, what they mean, how I can string them together. The threat to AI, or the threat that AI presents, is it removes humans from the thinking part of the equation. You have people going to class where it's not just directing them to the right answer or helping explain things to them. It's just doing the questions for them. It's not just helping them find sources for a paper. It's writing it for them. That's where it starts to get dicey. And we really need to be cautious about any tool that removes the human element, from creative pursuits like writing, learning, thinking, all the things that make us human, or else we're just going to be like those gremlins of WALL-E, wasting away watching Instagram reels all day.
Yeah, good thoughts. Peyton, what about you?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at this, because this is after my time of being in college. Mm-hmm. So ChatGPT wasn't even an option at all. And it's interesting because some of these students will never even have the opportunity to know what writer's block is. Like, that is such a real thing where you're just staring at a blank page and you have nowhere to go. And it's like, okay, put on some classical music, some movie themes, and do your best to get the creative juices flowing, versus being like, hey, give me a draft summary of this topic. It's interesting to me, since I never had that opportunity, but I don't know if it's just, my age, or if it's a little bit of an ethics thing for some of the basics. I do agree that as I was reading this article, it's helpful for some things like creating a schedule, creating a budget, creating some of those research tools like Ethan says. I think that is actually very helpful and valid. Now, I know some people would question, hey, for the budget or the schedule, I don't know if I want to give ChatGPT my information, because, it saves everyone's information, so that way it can utilize it in the database for future uses. So I think there's a balance, because now it's becoming so prolific, not only in education. So I like how this one teacher is trying to teach her students, it's here. How do we use it? How do we properly and ethically use it, but still develop your critical thinking? So use the tools at your disposal, kind of like we have calculators now. At some point, the calculator's doing a lot of work for you, but it enables you to have the time to do the deeper thinking or the deeper part of the mathematical problem versus, some of the basics. So I think it's a balance of technology. And one other thing that I'll mention is, have the balance for the basics, but then you still have to develop critical thinking. Like where I work at the law firm, we had an AI task force, because this is a very real thing, and AI tools are being used in so many elements. And where can we use it? Where can we not use it? And honestly, our department has chosen we really aren't, because we can't put in our client information. We can't put in our case information. We can't utilize those things. Therefore, it's good that a lot of our employees and staff are used to not using it, because it is not an option for many of them. So I think it's a balance, figuring out where you can use it, but understanding in some professions, you're not going to be allowed to use it. So you got to be ready to think on your own.
Yeah, Peyton and Ethan, y'all both make great points about not using it to replace your thinking. And I think for us, Ethan, I know you just finished undergrad more recently, and so ChatGPT was more of an option for you in your education. But when you were learning how to read or learning how to write a paper for the first time, it wasn't there. And so I think that's kind of my concern for today's kids, and as people are figuring out how they want to implement it, because it's not about producing efficiently, but are kids going to learn how to take those initial steps for themselves and then use it as a tool? And like Ethan said, he uses it to, you find the resources that it gives you, and then you go and you look at them and you vet them for yourself, and you are an adult and, educated enough to where you can do that. But somebody that is younger, not as experienced, they may not know what's a reliable resource or not. So this is something interesting I just wanted to add into the conversation. I've interviewed Emily Harrison both on the Know Why podcast and here at Point of View. And she is a leading thinker in terms of technology and specifically how it impacts kids. And she says there's a common misconception that because today's kids are digital natives, that they're especially adept at using new technology. In reality, yes, it's easy for them to use it, but they aren't actually being trained to know how it works. And so this is of concern because as they become more and more dependent on AI or large language models like ChatGPT, they're not learning basic computer skills. In fact, she said something that blew me away. A lot of young adults who are entering college have never learned how to type. Wow. Everything is a touch screen now for a lot of schools. Mm-hmm. And so there's just, I think maybe we can, teach kids how to understand how it works and kind of have those skills, but maybe have it be its own separate subject where you're kind of learning about artificial intelligence because it is in our world today, but it's not influencing everything, at least in grade school while kids are still getting those building blocks. We're about to go to a break in a couple minutes, but Ethan, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think what Peyton said was really important when she talks about overcoming writer's block, just little human struggles like that. Those are the things that actually make us human, right? Learning how to be bored or to overcome some sort of struggle. And I fear that newer generations just don't have the strength, the mental fortitude to really do that. I used to teach, entry-level business classes as part of my degree program in undergrad. And, I had a student one time tell me that I used too many words. It was 2 sentences. And this was a native English speaker at a 4-year university here in the United States. And I just thought, wow, you've really kind of ChatGPT'd your life away. And I felt really sad because I don't know how to help someone with that. And I think it just starts with families and it starts with educators. Yeah. Showing people that AI is a tool, but the real world is also a lot better. And you need to, thinking for yourself, there's some real joys that come with it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think some people that aren't dependent on it in the future are going to rise above the masses that are dependent on it. So if we have some listeners on the show, I would just encourage you, have a balance and look at it as a useful tool. I know this is going to be a little bit of a stretch, but just like people were, nervous about the railroad and electricity coming in, well, those are very real things that influenced our culture moving forward and just technological advances. AI is going to be a part of society in our life. Therefore, we have to learn how to be good stewards of it and where the balance of ethics and critical thinking are.
Yeah, so well said. So again, go to pointofview.net if you want to read that article from World Magazine for yourself. But how do we address this and how do we make sure that we are keeping our own thinking sharp and help the next generation do that as well? I think we have, I have some suggestions, and there's an article that I think posed some great suggestions, and we're going to talk about that when we come back from the break.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kirby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
Welcome back to the Millennial Round Table. So we just wrapped up our conversation on ChatGPT, or in other words, how people are wrestling with the ubiquity of AI in education. And we had just so many great comments, Ethan and Peyton. I think y'all bring such a good perspective because, as you pointed out, it is something that is going to, be in our lives in the future going forward. So it doesn't mean that we have to run away from it or be scared, but we do need to think biblically and critically about it and how it is affecting us. So I think, for a lot of people, the concern is how is it affecting education? And so for minds that are still being molded and learning how to think critically, we don't want to just be farming out all of our thinking to AI or to technology in general, because even before ChatGPT, our attention spans were growing shorter. We were already having a critical thinking problem, I think. So that's why I wanted to highlight this article. It's on pointofview.net, so you can look at it there. 5 steps to revive the liberal arts. Now, you may think, oh, this is kind of niche, or, but it's really relevant to our culture and just really talking about that robust debate that we mentioned at the beginning of the show with what Ethan was arguing about. We need to be able to think critically in order to have those debates. And I think, reviving the liberal arts, even in little ways in our own lives, is a great way to do that. So I'll give you the rundown really quick. In short, liberal arts education is an interdisciplinary foundation in the humanities, natural and social studies, and mathematics. So rather than focusing on a single field of study, it's designed to cultivate reason, moral character, and civic understanding. So the goal is to shape the student or the person into a critical thinker with problem-solving skills that apply across a wide range of fields and careers and endeavors in the future. So historically, this included reading the great books, foundational texts that influence our founders here in the United States, works of Aristotle, Plato, Aquinas. And in short, this really what a liberal arts education does is encourage us to grapple with what is good, true, and beautiful. And that is basically just really dying out in higher education for sure. We definitely have seen, and we can go, back a century to talk about how this began, but more of a leaning toward utilitarian education, basically with a lot of colleges becoming degree mills and ideological bubbles and not really focusing on the formation of character and thought. So anyway, this gives us some tips for how we can revitalize more of a liberal arts attitude in our own lives and in education. So, Ethan, I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can talk about this kind of from a unique perspective since I studied both business, kind of more of a practical degree, as well as poli-sci in undergrad. So I got to see kind of both sides of it. And it's true that people go to college to get jobs. That's just a reality. It's not like, it used to be 100 years ago when you go to college just to learn and expand your horizons. You do need to build a career at some point. And so that's unfortunate. But that doesn't mean we have to stop engaging with the humanities and liberal arts in our day-to-day life. I think a lot of people, especially young people, and I talk about this every time I'm on the show because I think it's so important, young people are lost. We've sort of taken the philosophical and community underpinnings of our society away. And so young people are they're here in the modern age. They don't really know where they came from. They don't know why they think what they think. And all they can see are the problems of the world. But for those young people that are really lost and they don't really know who they are, or who they're supposed to be, what their place is, I think the liberal arts are an excellent haven for that. I wasn't always a church-going guy. I didn't always, engage and think about these things. My life has gotten better when I started engaging and thinking about, why am I here? What does it mean to be a good man? And it's been such a source of inspiration and confidence for me. And I think it can do the same for a lot of young people that are feeling sort of adrift. And it's not just religion, right? You can read history books. That will give you such an appreciation for the culture and traditions that you've inherited. That will be a good guide for how to live your life and really instill you with gratitude. And so absolutely, if you're tired of the AI slop and the Instagram reels and the dull YA novels, maybe pick up a classic, figure out where you came from and what your responsibility is to continue those beautiful and sacred traditions.
Yeah, I agree. To truly appreciate and, like Ethan said, be grateful for even the here and now in America, we need the liberal arts. We need to study some of the great thinkers and philosophers, especially like ancient Greek. I mean, I can't imagine not having studied Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, because just to give a rundown, because I know some people can get confused between the three, which were known as the great three. Socrates was known for his method of questioning. He focused on ethics and virtue, emphasizing self-knowledge and critical thinking. That applies to the things we were just talking about. He breaks down what is the purpose of this? Like, why does this matter? Like, why should we be able to dialogue and debate and question? And here are the different dissecting the different parts of questioning to truly get to your opinion versus just being like, here's what's happening, you need to believe this, and versus having the masses just be like, okay, we are robots, we're just going to believe this. No, this teaches you to question things. And Plato, you know, he had his theories and explored topics like justice and beauty and the ideal in his writings, notably the Republic. And then, of course, there was Aristotle, who was logic and ethics and politics and natural science. Again, I think that's where some of the breakdown is in society is now, as we are being told, especially as millennials and Gen Z, things are expensive, get a job that will pay you, just focus on, you know, the basic credentials that get you the job, that will help you get into a house, help you have property. But then that's why, as Ethan was saying, people are kind of frustrated and kind of lost, is because they're not able to formulate these ideas and questions for themselves, or then see, oh, this is how America and the founding fathers got to where they were, because so much of it was based off some of the Greek and Roman philosophers and, you know, states of government. So I think it is so important. And this past weekend, I actually had the honor of hearing Jonathan Turley, who's an American attorney and legal scholar, speak. And he has a book that has come out, The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. And then he has another one coming out of Rage in the Republic. And in his speech, he talked about Plato and the philosophies. And also, this is going to sound funny to connect, but even Norman Rockwell, who is remembered for doing the basic things of being, you know, having an ice cream soda police officer with a young boy, or, you know, a man standing up and talking about, you know, free speech in the middle of a public forum. How do we fully understand and relate to those unless we see like the deeper reality and philosophy of just everyday life? So I think liberal arts and understanding the great philosophers helps us have more of appreciation for our government, our founding fathers, and even just life and little moments of love and joy and beauty and justice as a whole.
Yeah, very, very well said. So, you know, I do want to acknowledge that the higher education situation is not great right now. I mean, you've got skyrocketing tuition, inflation that's not, you know, salaries that aren't keeping pace with inflation. I was privileged to be able to go to one of these great books colleges that is mentioned in the article, where they do study kind of, you know, the liberal arts as regardless of what specific degree you get. But that just might not be an option for everyone. And many people are favoring trade school so that they can get a degree or get a career without the debt that comes along with a college degree often. And I think that those are all positive things. But what I love about this article is that it really gives you ways that you can just work it into everyday life, because I don't think you have to go to a great books college, even though I'm glad that those exist and are actually increasing, to really revive the liberal arts for yourselves. And as you know, Peyton and Ethan were saying, they can just offer so much insight and help us to sharpen those critical thinking skills. And so I think they're really important. So just to go through a few of the tips before the break that the article suggests. First of all, less than half of U.S. adults, report reading at least one book in the last year.
Wow.
So read a book for starters. And then, as Ethan said earlier, try to start with one of the classics. There are so many great resources out there, including podcasts that will help you go through classic literature, classic novels, some of the philosophers, as Peyton was discussing. Start a book club in your community. Get with some friends and say, hey, instead of just scrolling all the time, we want to actually engage in thoughtful conversation and read some of these ideas and do it together in community. You can actually contact your legislators once you learn more about, what does a liberal arts education mean, and encourage them to implement policies in your state that impact the way the kids in your area will learn. So there are a lot of ways that we can really decide that we're going to reclaim our education, even now, even in adulthood, and help set a good example for the next generation, that we want to be thinkers, not just, mindless eyeballs that scroll on social media all the time. So I would definitely recommend checking out that article. It's almost time for another break, but when we come back, I want to talk about where Americans really want to live, specifically young Americans. A lot of people talk down on Gen Z, but there are some hopeful signs here, and we'll discuss that when we come back from this short break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One more segment in this first hour of the Millennial Round Table, and then we'll have many more topics to discuss in the next hour. But let's talk about where young Americans really want to live. I'm excited to get, Ethan, your perspective as a Gen Zer, and I know, Peyton, you've got some thoughts on this too. So let me just briefly talk about this article from the American Enterprise Institute. So for years, you've had pundits insisting that young Americans are rejecting the suburbs. Millennials and Gen Z, they want to live in the urban areas, in walkable cities, in apartments, and that, kind of the typical American dream of the white picket fence and the cul-de-sac is dead. Like, nobody wants that anymore. But data shows the opposite. And we have, we hear a lot in headlines, and I think conservatives are rightly concerned about the fact that for a lot of young Americans, they're not as, they're getting married later, they're having kids later, and so people worry about family formation. But a lot of young adults actually want that. They want to be rooted in their communities. They want to be able to buy homes. They want to be able to raise their families there. But they're just kind of having that barrier where they're not really able to do that. And so a lot of policy issues come into play with that. But nearly 60% of 18 to 34-year-olds would choose to live in a detached home with a yard over an apartment or townhouse. And this is important because living, contrary to what some may argue or believe, living in suburbia or more of the, typical neighborhoods doesn't actually decrease civic involvement, but it actually increases it. And so I just think this is so important for the dialogue and civic engagement, like we've been talking about for this whole hour, really. So Ethan, I'd love to get your perspective on this issue with regard to housing and where young adults really want to live.
Certainly. Well, I may not be the best gauge for this since I'm about to move to a big city in an apartment to go to law school, but definitely moving out to the suburbs and buying a house is in the long-term plan for me. I want my kids to grow up with neighbors and in a backyard and a dog to play with in that backyard and all that good stuff. But I agree. Gen Z is kind of moving towards this property ownership angle and away from the dual income, no kids lifestyle with the brunches and the cat moms and the dog dads and all that ridiculousness. Because we're searching for something deeper and something more meaningful. That's kind of been the theme I've talked about earlier on this show. I think that's a really good thing. And I think it's good for our public good as well, because owning property gives you a stake in your community. It makes you care about what happens. It makes you less likely to take risks or even worse, commit crimes if you have a home to take care of, a home to lose. And so that's really, really good. That's actually why only property owners were allowed to vote in this country initially. Now, obviously, back then, not everyone could own property, and there were some problems with the system. But the general idea that the people who have a stake in a system are the ones deciding the direction it goes in, that speaks to the idea that people who own property are the ones who are most invested. They care more. They have a more centered moral outlook. And I absolutely think that property ownership is something everyone should strive to. And it's really a shame that my generation doesn't believe it's attainable by and large.
Peyton, your thoughts?
I feel like this article was reading my mail and is my life and so many of my friends' lives. So, for example, I am definitely the target demographic for this article because I am one of those that does drive about an hour every day, 5 days a week to work so that I am in a house that versus being in an apartment, because I wouldn't be able to afford something that's, say, closer to Dallas, if you will. So it's so interesting because so many of my friends and family, it's like, or more so my friends that are closer to my age, it's like they would love to have a house. And so they have to live farther out from their jobs. But then also I have some people that, are a little bit younger, or maybe they didn't finish school quite as soon. And they're just stuck. And they're in between. I know I have friends that were having to have a choice of, do we get a house first? Or we can't have a house, so we're going to have to start our family first and have the family in the, 1-bedroom apartment, and then they're stuck if they think about having a second kid and all the different things. So it's just this balance. But also, I did live in New York City for a summer. I lived in Manhattan when I was doing my internship at Fox News. Great intern experience. But I did have to ask myself the question, if I was to go back and apply, could I foresee myself living in New York another 10 years as I aspired to, say, the dream job? And finally, I kind of had to come to the conclusion for myself that, I think I want to settle down more so in Texas and have some more opportunity for space and that community, because even though it's the rustle and bustle of the city, so much is happening, so much nightlife, at the end of the day, when you're in some of those places too, you can feel the loneliest because you're just a number and no one knows you and you're just kind of there. You were to die, who would know? Who would care? Like, it's interesting versus like in the suburbs, in the community, people know each other, people help each other out. You get invited to barbecues and people have space for a pool and a backyard. And so it's just an interesting article that really breaks down a lot of the feelings that people have right now for millennials and Gen Z. Do I live closer to work and stay in an apartment long term? Or do I get a house and I drive? But so many are just stuck in the secular cycle of not being able to have the house and the property that they dreamed of.
Yeah, so there are some policy suggestions that have been put forward to address this because, it really does. I think you were right, both of you, on younger generations are craving that sense of rootedness and realizing that maybe, kind of those big city dreams that we had when we were younger, they're not going to give us that fulfillment or meaning in life that we really wanted. So it's interesting. There's actually a movement called Make My Move, or a company that incentivizes young couples to move away from the big metropolitan centers to fly over country where it's a lot more affordable, and they will give them deals on all these city benefits and everything if they move there. So we're kind of seeing a lot of Gen Zers actually take that option. So people have suggested selling off federal lands that didn't make it into the big, beautiful bill. I'm not sure if that's the ultimate solution, but I know people are talking about this. I think it's definitely a conversation we need to keep having with regard to policy, because young Americans do want the American dream. They want the home, they want the family and the kids and the connection, and it should be attainable for them. But we're almost out of time for this hour. Ethan, any final thoughts, and do you want to let us know where we can follow your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this conversation really touches on the broader issue of young people want community. And it used to be, if you're in the city, you would find community with social clubs or coworkers or classes or whatever it might be. That's sort of melting away as, the hours at work get longer and the atomization and isolation due to social media continues. So if you find yourself in a big city like I will be for the next few years, you got to make an effort to find that community and then get out to the suburbs and start that family when you can. You can find me on X at ERWatson13, but that's where I'm trying to grow my following.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us on the Millennial Round Table today, Ethan. Always value your perspective. So we're about to go to a break, but just as a reminder, if you're just now tuning in and maybe you missed some of what we talked about first, you can always go back to the website, pointofview.net, and read the articles we've discussed or listen to the show. We also have podcasts. So Point of View Radio Talk Show is on Apple Podcast, and every day the show is uploaded there, so you can listen to it in podcast form anytime. We have a couple other podcasts as well. I'll mention real quickly. Know Why Podcast, hosted by yours truly. And we also have highlights on Spotify put together by our audio engineer, Megan, with the best and most intriguing interviews from the broadcast, brought to you in a very short snippet that's easy to listen to. We have a lot more to discuss in the second hour, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this break.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places, and some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kirby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kirby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now your host for the Millennial Round Table, Liberty McArtor.
Thank you for being with us today on the Millennial Round Table. Heading into Hour 2, we've had a lot of great discussions already, so if you missed any of that, go to pointofview.net and check out the articles we discussed, and you can always listen to the program after as well. But right now, we still have Peyton Luke in the studio with us, and we are welcoming Will Barclay. Thanks for joining the Millennial Roundtable, Will.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
So Will is a Young Voices contributor as well as a political theorist, and he has an essay that I wanted to highlight. I think it's going to be really helpful for us to understand it. Will, if I'm correct, you just presented this at the International Political Science Association Congress in Seoul, South Korea. So just last week, so you've been busy. But this is an essay that you originally published in February called Populism, A Sheep in Wolf's Clothing. And I wanted to discuss this to start off the hour because, as you mentioned, we do hear a lot about populism, nationalism. We hear that a lot from the left in particular, and often it's villainized. So I do want us to be precise in our terminology and really understand what we're talking about. So can you kind of introduce us to your essay and some of the points that you make there?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. So I guess just in short, A Sheep in Wolf's Clothing argues that although various left-wing pundits and politicians have attempted to misconstrue all populism and right-wing ideology as anti-democratic, oppressive, and fascist, it's clear that populism and right-wing politics are not at all inherently antagonistic to democracy at all. But rather, if populist ideology and right-wing politics are really earnestly compared and contrasted with democracy and its fundamental principles, then it very much immediately becomes readily apparent that populism and democracy are pretty much indistinguishable, and that populism is really very much at best merely the moniker that left-wing politicians and pundits have attempted to surreptitiously attach to any unwanted political outcomes and conservative results in an effort to very much ignore the real needs of the state and bedrock of any democracy, its people.
So walk us through some of those specific similarities, because, again, I think, a lot of people maybe that aren't familiar with different political ideologies and those different definitions. They think of the right, they think of, conservatism in general, or just, Republican. But what are some of those similarities between populism and democracy that you point out?
Yeah, for sure. So firstly, populism and democracy both confirm that individual people are unequivocally the most important aspect of any state, and that within any nation, a populace must necessarily govern itself. I think more importantly, populism and democracy both contend that if a state does not pursue the needs and the will of its populace, then it's become corrupt and must be immediately reformed. Moreover, populism and democracy both agree that the individual human rights of every person are of paramount import and utterly inviolable. And in fact, populism and democracy both agree that even a state's most urgent needs and political objectives cannot at all supersede or circumvent the rights and freedom of its people. In addition, populism and democracy both contend that a free market economy is the ideal economic mode as well as the only ethical economic system. I think very much in truth, populism and democracy both emphatically reject every aspect of a hierarchical or stratified society and constantly attempt to provide every citizen with an identical opportunity to not merely participate in the political process, but to earnestly self-determine economically as well as politically.
So you do see this emphasis on, individual human rights, free markets, and really the power of the people. Peyton, your thoughts?
Sure. I actually had a question for Will because I found this article really, really fascinating. But I was wondering, what made you, Will, passionate about this particular topic? And why do you think it's so important that people read this topic and article and truly start to understand the breakdown and the differences?
Yes, I think it's for me. It's because I think that, as I was saying before, populism and democracy are very much indistinguishable from one another. And I very much think that this ghoul of populism has very much been trotted out in order to very much frighten and scare people away from the right wing of the political spectrum. And because of this, we've seen people very much become quite oppressed and persecuted, not just in America, but in states such as Germany, France, and even in Canada. And as you know, I'm from Canada, and so that's just an issue that's very near and dear to my heart, in all honesty.
Yeah, so I wanted to mention that too, Will, because you are from Canada, and then I know that you write about issues happening in Europe as well. And so it does seem to be an effort with a lot of, pundits on the left to villainize any sort of right-wing ideology and make it kind of like, oh, that's a bad, scary word. We're not going to identify with that. But are you seeing, kind of a rise in some of these other nations as well in populism and more concern with kind of like those similarities with democracy? Are you seeing more people identify with that, and what do you think is behind that?
Yeah, so I think that very much since the advent of Trump's first presidency in 2016, pundits and political actors have consistently deployed populism as kind of like a catch-all term for neo-Nazis, racists, and also be so bigot in an attempt to very much delegitimize President Trump and discredit the American people's rejection of the political status quo and Hillary Clinton. I think very much also post-2016 populism has also been transformed into a euphemism for any tyrannical or authoritarian regime, as well as fascism, pretty much, and any politics that are anti-democratic or violate human rights. And along with this, very much because all right-wing ideology has been lumped in there under this brand or moniker of populism, so too has pretty much gone like one half of the political spectrum. And I think very much what we've seen is that populism has become not just merely a competing ethos, but an enemy that must invariably be eradicated and destroyed, very much along with its adherents, due to the fact that it's been misconstrued as evil and then explicitly dangerous to the well-being of any democracy in person.
Yeah, there definitely, I think you're right. There's motivation. Instead of having dialogue and debate and talking about different political ideologies, like we discussed in the first hour of the Millennial Round Table, people just want to kind of categorize everything they don't agree with as evil, and we're definitely seeing that. Peyton, any final thoughts on this?
Sure. I liked one of his paragraphs here that explains it pretty well. It's like, if populism is earnestly compared and contrasted with democracy, then it immediately becomes evident that populism and democracy are actually overwhelmingly similar and happily share various foundational principles and values. I think that's a good breakdown for it for people that maybe haven't looked at this topic in that way or been able to kind of understand the similarities. They just see them as kind of warring against each other. And he goes on to say, readily apparent that populism is merely the moniker the left has imposed upon any unwanted right-wing political outcomes and conservative results in an effort to ignore the bedrock of any democracy. It's people.
Yeah. So well written, Will, and well said, Peyton. So again, we thought that would be an educational article and something that's helpful, especially as we hear a lot of these terms from pundits in the media, and we want to know, what does that mean? What are we talking about? So we encourage you to look at that article for yourself at pointofview.net. We're about to go to a break, but when we come back, I do want to talk about something that, I'll be honest, is concerning me, kind of a movement that you are seeing on the right wing. So we want to be careful in our definitions, and we know that there is a lot of undue criticism or hyperbole from the left, but there are some legitimate concerns as well. So we need to be able to thread the needle and talk about all of that with honesty. So when we come back, we're going to discuss an article from the Free Press called The Right's 1939 Project. What is that all about? You can read it at pointofview.net, and we'll be right back to discuss it in just a moment.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Radical elements on the street are making radical demands of Democrats. Earlier this month, Axios interviewed more than 24 House Democrats. They related a growing anger among the Democratic base. The lawmakers reported that at town hall meetings and in individual meetings, activists demanded more violence. They were told that what they were doing to confront the Trump administration and ICE agents was not enough. The activists even suggested there needs to be blood to grab the attention of the press and the public. One radical suggested what we really need to do is be willing to get shot. In a recent commentary, Joshua Arnold believes that the foundation of all these statements is a Marxist worldview that has jettisoned Christianity's regard for human dignity, and that has reimagined all human relationships essentially as power struggles. This is a call for a social revolution that will overturn the existing social order. He reminds us that Marxist tactics usually just involve constant destruction of powers that be, with no thought of constructive rebuilding. In previous commentaries, I've quoted other authors and pundits who also remind us that the left wants to destroy, but rarely provides any blueprint for rebuilding. We should remember that the current radicalism in the streets didn't start with the 2024 election of Donald Trump. America has suffered through numerous protests in the past that resulted in blocked traffic, defaced property, burning buildings, and injured police officers. Democratic leaders have a choice to make. Do they encourage these radicals, or do they suggest that they try to make their case and work for the next election? The radicals have already made it clear that they think civility isn't working. That is why many of these leaders are saying nothing and are just trying to ignore them. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to the Millennial Round Table. I want to discuss this article from the Free Press. I think they highlight a lot of issues that are really kind of the undercurrent of some, ideological movements within the United States. And so this is one that I think we need to talk about. We don't often talk about a lot of the figures mentioned in this article on Point of View, but there is so much influence, especially with online streaming, with kind of podcasts becoming so popular that and just kind of where we are on the right, so to speak, where the young thinkers are on the right. And so this is definitely something that I think is influential, at least for a portion of kind of the younger right-wing movement. So I wanted to discuss it. It's called The Right's 1939 Project, How a Visible Faction of the MAGA Movement is Revising American History, Reviving Dangerous Conspiracies, and Erasing the Taboo Against Open Bigotry. So I'll kind of give a rundown of the article, and then I'd love to get both your perspectives, Will and Peyton, and see if you agree. And if you disagree, if you think that this is, kind of overkill in terms of maybe too much concern where it's not warranted, then I'd love to hear that perspective as well. But the title is a play on of the 1619 Project, which you've probably heard about. It was kind of an initiative of the New York Times, which really was revising history to say that slavery in America was not just a tragedy, not just the original sin of America, so to speak, but actually the foundational aspect of the United States. And you had many, many historians from across the ideological spectrum, I will say, come out and really say, hey, this isn't good history, like this isn't accurate. And so there's not an official movement called the 1939 Project. That's actually the author's title. But she's arguing that in the same way that the 1619 Project tried to revise the history around America's founding, that you do have a faction on the right that is really trying to revise American history, particularly surrounding America's place in the world post-World War II. And so you have some very influential figures. Obviously, you have Candace Owens, who boasts a very broad audience with her podcast, and she has been very critical of Trump and definitely said some anti-Semitic things, to put it mildly. Tucker Carlson also has been extremely critical of Trump and suggested that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is controlling U.S. policy, and probably the biggest area for concern, though, I think, is at Turning Point USA, which is an organization founded by Charlie Kirk, and we've praised him here on Point of View before. But at their conference this year, they actually hosted a debate that featured David Smith, who really was saying, kind of repeating some anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and kind of furthering the notion that Israel is controlling the United States. And you've had Tucker Carlson say things like, that Europe might have been better under Hitler than, and Winston Churchill was potentially the villain of World War II. And again, all of this may sound fringe to you and say, why are we even discussing this? But because these figures do have such a big audience on the right, and you have Turning Point USA, which is so influential among young conservatives, the fact that these are not just fringe thoughts anymore, but they're being, these conversations are happening on Tucker Carlson's show. They're happening on Joe Rogan podcast, which is the most popular podcast in the world. So I think we need to talk about it and respond to it. So, Will, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on this article? Do you see this as a concern on kind of the right of the political spectrum, or do you think it's overblown?
So I think there's but that's the kernel of truth, right? And that's, I think, the thing that certainly America have been for a while. The majority of Americans currently believe that America.
Well, I'm going to come back to you in just a moment because we're having a little bit of an issue with your connection. But Peyton, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's one paragraph in this that's talking about how some of the people were saying, death to America. And that is just so sad. But also, as you were mentioning, some of them were insinuating it might be better under Hitler than what's happening now. And that just, oh my gosh, breaks my heart. There is a picture in here too they have a picture of Hitler walking in Paris right next to the Paris Olympics, where it was, the picture of the Last Supper with the drag queens. Mm-hmm. And someone ended up writing this on X. This may be putting it too crudely for some, but the picture on the left, which is Hitler, was infinitely preferable in virtually every way than the one on the right, which is the Last Supper. And it's just shocking and interesting how people are looking at all of these world events and history and trying to rewrite history. And you were saying, Liberty, it's really important to break this down and talk about this, because if you have people like Joe Rogan, you have people like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson discussing this, or maybe twisting some of the situations, it's really important to then examine it from a Christian worldview, from a biblical worldview, from a Jewish worldview, from people of faith, and look at this and break it down. And yeah, I would be so interested to hear also Will's take on this as well.
Definitely. So hopefully we'll get him back on the line in a minute. But again, one thing that I think plays into this is the fact that, and this is pointed out in the article, that today pundits and people who do have a big audience like Carlson, they're there is an incentive that rewards sensationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so people want to say something that is shocking, that they know might be controversial. And I think we have this on the right, too, because you do have legitimate concerns about political correctness. So sometimes, though, I think people can err in the opposite extreme of just saying offensive things. But these aren't just things that people are saying to get a rise, though. I think you have more people actually believing some of this revisionist history. But Will, I think you're back with us. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so for sure, I think there's two big points I'd like to get to. I think that the reason this has occurred is very much a symptom of the kind of amoral politics that have gripped the international political system. And I think it's very much only really possible because good and evil have become very much altogether lacking or missing from modern politics. I think that very much the leftist edifice that currently dominates all politics and media, particularly worldwide, has long rejected the notion of objective truth and successfully excised really any a priori unwavering good and evil from all contemporary political discourse. And therefore, people on both sides of the political spectrum, unless they're very much active, attentive readers and consumers of media in popular culture, well, they very much found themselves bereft of any real meaning. And so they struggle to imbue their lives with purpose. And I think this is a lot of it, let's say, when we step outside the Scott Carlson and the Candace Owens realm, why it's become so appealing is because it allows people to really inject their lives and an existence that was previously meaningless with purpose and meaning. And I think that's sorely lacking for so many people throughout America.
Oh, yeah. Great insight. Peyton, I think you had something you wanted to say as well.
Yeah, this one paragraph is so good and I think breaks it down well for our listeners. It says, due to our geographic blessings, Americans often experience a recurring impulse to retreat inward, but the narrative offered by the 1939 Project will not offer a safer alternative than facing the growing threat from multiple imperialist authoritarian powers. Indeed, a movement that recasts America as the villain, that depicts our history of global leaderships as malevolent, and that seeks to rewrite the moral foundation of America's post-war identity is more than isolationist. It is delusional. And so I think it's really important that we don't listen to some of these things that try to recast America as the villain and re-question all of the things that happened throughout history. Or it's good to go in and question it and find the truth versus just taking it from these influential individuals that are talking about it and take it as gospel truth.
Yeah. Very good points. And Will, what you said about the loss of any sort of comprehension of good and evil in our politics, I think that really that's the core of so much of what we're seeing, both on the far left and the far right. And so that's why I wanted to highlight it, because when you have a worldview vacuum and you don't have a moral code or a framework for understanding the world anymore, then like you said, Will, people are going to search for meaning. They're going to search for a place to place their identity and try to make sense of everything that's wrong with the world. And so unfortunately, when people don't have a biblical worldview or some sort of, foundational moral code, then that can lead to some very hateful places. But more on this and a lot more topics right after this break.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
Welcome back to the Millennial Round Table. Just a few more thoughts on the article we were recently discussing, the Wright's 1939 project, which is in reference to the year before World War II, instead of kind of focusing on the post-World War II era in which the United States has been very influential around the world. So one of the other reasons that I wanted to highlight this is because it may even, this kind of line of thinking, this revisionist history that is on the right and very anti-Israel, often anti-Semitic, and is becoming more influential online on podcasts, which are popular with younger adults, particularly young men. The Free Press actually had another article a few months ago on kind of this extremism on the right and how it is a lot more pervasive than many parents and grandparents realize. And so I think it's just important to be aware of when, you may not realize that your college-age son is listening to a podcast that is, a mainstream podcast like Joe Rogan or Tucker Carlson that is featuring a historian who cast Winston Churchill as the villain of World War II and argues that Europe would have been better under Nazi rule than it is today. And so I think that it is important to just be aware that young adults are hearing this message and that it is kind of becoming maybe more influential than many people realize. Will, you mentioned, which I thought was so insightful, that you have this kind of thinking when there's a lack of really a more moral underpinning to our politics. So I'd love to get any final thoughts on this topic or your suggestions for how people can combat this.
Yeah, for sure. No, thank you so much. I think very much it's been misconstrued as kind of America becoming a pawn or instrument of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, when in reality it's America very much pursuing its traditional role as a champion of democracy and a friend of the Jewish people everywhere. I think the other thing, too, one of the things that this article really highlights to me is really the so-called exceptional nature of anti-Semitism, so to speak. If we take a look at anti-Black racism, it's predicated upon this belief that Black people are somehow deficient or less human, let's say, than a normal person, yeah? And this is true for all types of the isms, racism, ageism, sexism, etc. But anti-Semitism, it's very much the opposite. It's predicated upon the notion that Jews aren't just sufficient, but they're almost too proficient, right? So much so, in fact, that they will necessarily enslave and commandeer all of Gentile society and any non-Jews if they're not properly or appropriately oppressed and restricted in some way. And I think that's a fundamental difference between the two, and it's how this is kind of like wielded deceptively and almost creeps up.
Yeah, and that's a really insightful difference. I'm glad you pointed that out. And again, we always want to talk about things from a biblical perspective on point of view. And so that is so important for Christians to be aware of this and to say, no, that's not biblical, that's not true, and to really speak the truth in this regard. But Peyton, any final thoughts?
Yeah, a little bit more of a point of encouragement for people as well, because when you really dive into this, the people that are behind the 1939 Project, although they have increasing cultural power online, the policy outcomes, they're losing. So, and kind of like us here, we're hearing this and we're concerned and we're like, that's not right or that's not true. So even though you might see it as prolific online in some of the podcasts, understand that, still within policy and the everyday person, for the most part, they're losing. So what remains entirely uncertain is whether the Republican leaders will have the courage to see what's unfolding in front of their eyes and then the courage to publicly and loudly reject it.
Yeah, well said. So just one little resource. This is a book that we actually, Kirby and I were able to both interview the author, Jeff Myers from Summit Ministries. He had a small book on Should Christians Support Israel? And so I think it gives a lot of really good answers and just kind of cultural and historical context to this issue, which has been going on for a long time and always seems to resurge in politics. And so Peyton and Will, you both have had some great perspectives on this. But I would just encourage somebody, if maybe you want to learn more about, Israel in particular and why the U.S. is allies with Israel, then look at this book, Should Christians Support Israel by Jeff Myers. And if you search Jeff Myers on pointofview.net, you can find that interview that we did. But let's move on. I want to talk about something else. And so we've discussed immigration a lot on Point of View, and we know that President Donald Trump has really just ended illegal border crossings practically. I mean, it's just a huge difference when you compare the Biden administration to just the first 6 months of President Trump's current administration. And so deporting illegal immigrants and cutting down on kind of the chaos at the border was very popular with American voters. However, we want to also make sure that we're being careful and we're being just here. And so Chelsea Sobolik has an article in the National Review. I've interviewed her before in my past work as a journalist and followed her. I think she is, does a really good job at having a biblical perspective on a lot of these issues. And so she highlights the plight of vulnerable Afghans in our country who are at risk of facing a lot of persecution if they are deported back to Afghanistan. And so they previously enjoyed temporary protective status as refugees, which has been terminated. And so she's kind of highlighting, the concern there for us who are concerned about religious persecution in other nations, where it's going to be very extreme. Should we be, sending those people out of the United States? Peyton, do you have any thoughts or want to walk us through some of the points here?
Sure. So in case some people that are listening aren't as familiar with what's going on, in May, Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem announced the termination of temporary protected status, which is TPS, for refugees from Afghanistan. And this was going to be effective July 14th. So TPS is a temporary legal immigration status that provides protection from deportation and work authorization for eligible individuals from designated countries experiencing crisis. So Secretary Noem's justification with this was improvements in the security and economic situation within Afghanistan. And she stated that Afghanistan does not pose a threat to personal safety due to ongoing armed conflict or extraordinary and temporary conditions. So people are concerned, and we've had ministry leaders rise up and other people state, no, things are still bad within Afghanistan, particularly if you are a woman, and then particularly if you are a person of faith. You could still be killed going there. And on top of it, women aren't allowed to, go very far without maybe a chaperone. They aren't allowed to have education beyond the 6th grade. There are so many more things that are going on. Sadly, child bride situations. So if you were to send back some of these refugees that are here within the states, they could still be harmed, persecuted. If you are a Christian and you go back there, if you are a male, you're probably going to be killed. If you're a female, I don't even know if I want to say some of the things that would happen on air. So that is why they're concerned, and that's why people are standing up and saying, no, the situation in Afghanistan is not yet safe enough for people of faith, and that's why they're trying to seek relief, particularly for people of faith.
Yeah. Will, I know you've written about just the immigration and, lack of borders problems around the world, including in Europe. But I think that, my perspective is we have to make sure that we're being just and enforcing these policies. But I'd love to get your perspective on kind of this particular issue and where we draw the line on things.
Yes, I definitely agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think with regards to those people whose personal ideology and values are coherent with a liberal democratic ideology, I'm certainly on the same page. I'm certainly on board. I think that the problem kind of becomes when we start talking about people with inherently contradictory ideologies. And I think that very much a problem is that there are certainly Christians who are being persecuted in Afghanistan, women, but that persecution is not really unique. Virtually everyone in Afghanistan, outside of a very tiny and brutal privileged few, live in an utterly beleaguered existence due to the norms and values of the civilization there. And until something is cultivated there in Afghanistan, that's going to continue to be the case. And I think that's very much our job. I think that our job is to improve the state of existence in Afghanistan so that democracy, human rights can prosper there. I think also there's a point that you can't be a person of faith. And I think that that's in a way kind of inaccurate. I think that you can be a person of faith. You just simply have to be a person of the Muslim faith. And that's very much the problem. Outside of that particular denomination, there's not really a lot of room for ideological plurality.
Yeah, definitely. So Afghanistan is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a Christian, and conversion from Islam to Christianity is punishable by death under Islamic law. So yes, you can be a person of faith, but a very limited very limited in that. And so this is just an article I wanted to bring to your attention because I do think it's an issue that probably a lot of you care about, a lot of Christians care about. So we can discuss this a little bit more right after the break. But if you'd like to read it for yourself, you can find the link at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes on Point of View's Millennial Round Table. So we were just discussing an article from the National Review, America Should Continue to Protect Vulnerable Afghans in Our Country. And so just to kind of round that out, Chelsea Sobolik, the author, says during President Trump's first term, protecting domestic and international religious freedom was a policy priority. Consistent with this, President Trump and his administration should protect Afghan women and girls, Afghan Christians, and our Afghan allies, all of whom face violence, oppression, and possibly death if they return to Afghanistan. So something to watch. Peyton, did you have any final thoughts there?
Sure. Final thoughts that in May, as I was saying, a group of prominent faith leaders sent a letter actually to President Trump and Secretary Noman, urging them to protect particularly Afghan Christians. And as Will said, because, you know, if you're not of the Muslim faith, that's probably where you're going to face more of the persecutions. And so if the Christians are facing deportation, they were asking to sustain the U.S. refugee resettlement program as a lifeline for those fleeing religious persecution in Afghanistan. And so the White House has said of Afghan Christians that Afghans lacking the legal grounds to stay and fearing persecution on protected grounds may apply for asylum and have the courts adjudicate their case. So I know that on the 19th, when this article was published, they said that the Court of Appeals had put in place a stay, which was temporary protecting. However, that stay was only in place until the 21st, which was at the time of the show airing yesterday. I looked up for an update over the commercial break. I didn't see one, but it's important for us to keep our eyes on this. If you know some of the asylum seekers from Afghanistan, be praying for your brothers and sisters as they walk through this situation.
Yes, definitely. Be in prayer, something to keep an eye on, and potentially contact your officials about if you feel strongly about that. And we always encourage people to take action as well. So one more article I wanted to highlight before the end of the show, and it has been packed. I think we've gotten to every topic. I wasn't sure if we were going to make it just because there was a lot of things that we wanted to discuss today, but I think we're going to get there. This is another article from World Magazine, and it is talking about something that we've seen a lot of headlines about, and that is kind of a religious revival among Gen Z. I've talked about this on the podcast. I think Kirby even did an interview on kind of an adjacent topic to this yesterday on the show on how a lot of Gen Zers are returning to church. So this article kind of advises or admonishes some care or hesitancy to really say it's a revival because we really won't know if this trend sticks for a while. And there are still a lot of people who are not returning to religious affiliation or who are still leaving churches. But I wanted to highlight it, Will, because we see so much data. And there's actually even another research project I just discovered this week. It's called the Global Flourishing Research Project, where they look at people around the world to see what truly causes people to thrive and flourish. And it's, not necessarily, a high GDP per capita and personal wealth, but so much of it comes down to relationships and a guiding faith or philosophy and kind of that moral code that you were mentioning a few minutes ago. So, Will, what's your reaction to this in terms of kind of maybe the start of a trend that we're seeing of young people interested in religion again?
Yeah, so I very much disagree with what the author is up to. I very much agree with what you're saying that young people are entirely interested in religion and structure more so than ever. One of my big contentions with the article is that it adopts a very Catholic-centric viewpoint, and it speaks very much about people leaving the Catholic Church as though that's synonymous with all of Christianity, religion, and kind of conservatism or the right wing, right? And in a way, you can understand why people might be leaving the Catholic Church in particular. Prior to this very, very new Pope, the Catholic Church did adopt some questionable stances that did seem to conflict with established Christian doctrine and served to emphatically undermine the trust of the people in the institution of the Catholic Church. But it's not at all reflective of the views of young people with regards to right-wing ideology or religious ideology generally. I think here in Canada, actually, when we did our mock elections, right-wing people overwhelmingly elected the Conservative Party instead of a Liberal Party. And in Korea, I think Christianity is the dominant religion, if not the fastest growing. And I think that this maybe highlights another issue. It adopts only a very American-centric Catholic viewpoint, right? It's entirely American-centric. And so it would help us to adopt maybe a more global cosmopolitan perspective before we start to condemn the decline of religion everywhere.
Yeah, and that is such a good point because so often we can really have a very small view looking at, okay, what's happening here? But around the world, the church is really exploding, like you say. Peyton, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's good to look at it from the international perspective, even though a lot of us, want to look at it from, say, the local level or the American level. I do think that there is still a very large population of atheists and agnostics, or, quote, as the article says, nothing in particular, pretty high, with the millennials. So it's interesting, though, because as one of the poll quotes says in the article, yes, there are genuinely encouraging signs worthy of attention, hope, and thanks to God. But while anecdotes can inspire, they aren't data. So I think what we need to do is also look at the data. Even if we don't agree necessarily with this article, what does the data say within, your local church, your local synagogue, and all the things that are going on, and be encouraged and inspired. And also, I would say I almost want to, take it another step and say, encourage your brothers and sisters to be involved with church, to be involved with their small groups, no matter what the articles say, no matter what, say, the quote unquote data internationally or locally say. At the end of the day, be inspired, get in the Word of God, and be involved with your local community and local faith group.
Yeah, good insight, definitely. I think what we are seeing here kind of at the root of this, and what, Will, you were alluding to, is that a lot of young people are really tired of the pervasive, worldview that they've been given as they've been brought up, kind of this identity politics, and, everything is a battle between the oppressed and the oppressor. And I think there is a longing for more traditional value, or for something to make sense of the world. And so I think that's why you're seeing an interest in some of these, more traditional religious expressions. And then again, around the world, you are seeing the church, on a broader sense, really thrive. And so I think it's encouraging, and I think it's an opportunity to really step in and say, hey, you're looking for answers. Let's talk about the deeper issues of life, because you may find that you are encountering open ears when it comes to your younger neighbors and friends. I can't believe we're almost out of time for this Point of View show today, but it has been a great conversation. Will, before we let you go, where can people follow your work?
You guys can follow me right now on Twitter X at Will Barclay BBC, and I should have a Substack up before too long, so I'll have that posted there as well. If you feel like reaching out to me directly, you can email me at william.barclay@pcbg.ca. Thank you so much.
Yes. Yeah, look forward to reading your Substack. And Peyton, where can people follow your work and what you're doing at First Liberty Institute?
For sure. So I'm going to plug First Liberty, firstliberty.org. We do exclusively religious liberty, so anything from the local level all the way up to the Supreme Court. If discriminations within the military and employment and religious institutions, all the above. So if you ever find yourself in that situation, feel free to reach out to us, firstliberty.org.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for being with us on the Millennial Round Table today. I'm Liberty McArtor, and you can find more of what I do at knowwhypodcast.com. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Megan, for your work on the show today, and we'll see you tomorrow on Point of View.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.